At 18,000 feet over the Solomon Islands in August 1943, Lieutenant Richard Bong's world compressed into 4 seconds of calculation. 3 Japanese Zeros had materialized from the sun, and his wingman's P-38 Lightning was already spiraling toward the Pacific, trailing smoke like a funeral ribbon. Now the lead Zero slid behind Bong's tail, the Japanese pilot's fingers tightening on the cannon trigger. Bong executed the textbook response: hard right bank, full throttle, climb for altitude. But the Zero turned inside him, tighter, faster, impossibly agile. The Japanese fighter was already settling into firing position. What Bong did next wasn't in any manual, wasn't taught at any training base from California to Arizona. It violated every principle drilled into American pilots. He rolled his P-38 completely inverted, upside down, and yanked the stick forward. Instead of climbing away from death, he dove toward it. Blood exploded toward his head, his vision flooded crimson at the edges. For 2 eternal seconds he couldn't read his instruments, couldn't see the ocean rushing up, couldn't see anything but red. When he rolled level at 12,000 feet, gasping, his vision clearing in patches, the Zero was above him. The Japanese pilot had overshot completely, out of position, confused. Bong was alive. He just stumbled onto a tactic that would reshape air combat across the Pacific theater. More than that, he'd discovered that the human body and American aircraft could do things aviation medicine and engineering insisted were impossible. This is the story of how desperate men flying upside down rewrote the rules of aerial warfare, not from command desks in Washington, but from cockpits where the choice was innovation or death. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 entered combat over China in 1940 as something close to aerial perfection. By December 1941, when America stumbled into war, Japanese pilots had accumulated thousands of combat hours perfecting their craft. They knew every advantage their mount possessed, and they knew exactly how to force American pilots into situations where those advantages became overwhelming. The mathematics of air combat are brutally simple. Turn radius depends on velocity and g-force loading. The Zero's lightweight construction, achieved partly by eliminating armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, gave it a turning radius roughly 400 feet tighter than a P-38 Lightning and nearly 500 feet tighter than an F-4F Wildcat. At speeds below 300 miles per hour, the Zero could outturn virtually anything in the sky. In traditional turning dogfights, the kind emphasized in American training programs, the Zero pilot could simply circle inside his opponent's turn and achieve a firing solution within seconds. It was geometry as destiny. The American pilot, trying to follow, found himself on the outside of the circle, bleeding energy, becoming the target instead of the hunter. Early engagement reports from the Philippines and Java told a grim story written in casualties. By mid-1942, kill ratios in some sectors favored Japanese pilots 3-1. Squadron commanders were filing reports that essentially admitted defeat. We cannot win turning fights against this aircraft. The F-4F Wildcat, backbone of Navy and Marine fighter squadrons, had superior diving speed and could absorb more battle damage than the Zero, but its rate of roll was sluggish, making it vulnerable in the twisting knife fights that erupted at medium altitudes. The P-40 Warhawk performed well in vertical maneuvers, but suffered at higher altitudes where many engagements occurred. The P-38 Lightning had twin engines and concentrated firepower, but its wide turning radius made it prey in horizontal combat. Each American fighter type had advantages: firepower, armor, dive speed, but none could match the Zero's agility in conventional maneuvering. Pilots were told to use their aircraft's strengths, avoid turning engagements, maintain energy advantage. Sensible advice. But combat rarely unfolded according to plan, and sensible advice didn't help when a Zero latched onto your tail at 15,000 feet with nowhere to run. What made this crisis worse was the skill level of Japanese naval aviators in 1942 and early 1943. Many had been flying combat missions since the late 1930s. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, and formation tactics at an expert level. They'd refined their techniques through years of combat over China, learning to exploit every advantage their aircraft possessed. A common Japanese tactic involved one Zero acting as bait, flying straight and level, appearing vulnerable. When an American pilot committed to the attack, two more Zeros would drop from above or slide in from the flanks. The American fighter was suddenly defensive, and defensive meant entering a turning fight, which meant the Zeros' advantages became overwhelming, which meant death arrived in the form of 20mm cannon shells. American pilots were essentially asked to defeat an opponent who owned the most important advantage in dogfighting while flying aircraft optimized for survivability rather than maneuverability. The armor plate behind the pilot seat, the self-sealing fuel tanks, the heavier armament, these features kept pilots alive when hit, but they also added hundreds of pounds that increased wing loading and expanded turning radius. It was a cruel equation: protection versus performance, survival versus victory. And in the first year of the Pacific War, American pilots were learning that you couldn't win if you were dead, but you also couldn't win if you couldn't outfight the enemy. In every training base across America, from Arizona's desert airfields to California's coastal stations, instructors delivered the same warning about negative G flight. Don't do it, ever. When a pilot experiences positive G forces, the kind generated during normal turns and climbs, blood is pushed towards the feet. Vision narrows. At around 5 to 6 Gs, many pilots experience grayout or blackout. This was understood, documented, manageable. Pilots could train to increase their G tolerance, learn to tense muscles, and control breathing. But negative G forces? That was different. That was forbidden territory. When a pilot rolls inverted and pulls the stick forward, blood rushes toward the head. The effect is called redout, because the visual field literally turns crimson as blood vessels in the eyes engorge. Aviation medicine in 1942 suggested humans could barely tolerate negative G forces. Studies indicated that even -2 Gs caused severe discomfort, disorientation, and potential retinal damage. The official guidance was clear and unambiguous: avoid negative G flight entirely. Engine failure, structural damage, pilot incapacitation, the risks were considered catastrophic. Training manuals specifically warned against any maneuver that would create sustained negative G loading. These weren't arbitrary restrictions. They were based on research, on engineering specifications, on the accumulated wisdom of aviation development. Conventional aircraft engines, particularly those with carburetor-based fuel systems, could experience fuel starvation during inverted flight. Oil systems might fail. Control surfaces might respond unpredictably, and the pilot himself might lose consciousness or suffer permanent injury. But these studies were conducted in controlled environments with test pilots who weren't being shot at. The researchers who wrote the warnings had never faced a Zero pilot sliding into firing position with 4 seconds until cannon fire tore through their aircraft. They'd never done the mathematics of survival, where temporary blindness competed against permanent death. The choice wasn't comfortable versus uncomfortable. It wasn't regulation compliance versus violation. It was temporary crimson vision versus 20mm shells through the cockpit. When framed that way, the calculus changed entirely. The tactic that would eventually save countless American lives didn't emerge from the tactical development boards at 5th Air Force headquarters or the training schools stateside. It emerged from raw desperation in the skies over New Guinea and the Solomons, where the difference between innovation and obituary was measured in seconds. Early instances were pure instinct. A pilot with a Zero closing in, conventional maneuvers failing, aircraft handling getting sluggish, would make a split-second decision born from nothing but survival instinct. Roll inverted, push forward, dive. The first time it happened, the pilot probably thought he was dying. Blood rushing to the head, vision going red, instruments unreadable, the ocean or jungle rushing up. For 2 or 3 seconds, complete sensory chaos. Then vision clearing, the aircraft responding, and, impossibly, the Zero was no longer in firing position. Most pilots who survived these desperate maneuvers chalked it up to luck. They returned to base, said little about how they'd escaped, focused on the fact that they were alive when they probably shouldn't be. The tactic remained invisible, individual, unrepeatable. Until Major Thomas Lynch. On April 11, 1943, Lynch led a 4-plane patrol of P-38 Lightnings out of Port Moresby, New Guinea.
At 20,000 feet over Huon Gulf, his formation encountered 8 Zeros. Instead of engaging in a traditional horizontal fight, a death sentence against those odds, Lynch did something different when the lead Zero closed in on him. He rolled inverted, deliberately, not in panic, not as a last resort, but as a planned tactical maneuver. He pulled through into a steep dive, accelerated past 400 miles per hour, then rolled level at 8,000 feet. The Zero pilot attempting to follow pulled out at 12,000 feet, either unwilling or unable to match Lynch's dive angle and speed. But Lynch didn't just survive, he reversed the situation. After leveling out, he had both altitude separation and superior speed. He used that energy advantage to climb back up, approaching the now disorganized Japanese formation from below. The Zeros had lost their cohesion, chasing after what they thought were fleeing American fighters. Lynch shot down 2 Zeros in the ensuing engagement. His wingmen, following his example through the inverted dive, survived without losses. The after-action report noted the tactic, but didn't emphasize it. Official doctrine still discouraged negative G maneuvers. But what made Lynch's actions significant was intentionality. Other pilots had rolled inverted under duress and survived. Lynch recognized it as a repeatable technique, a tactical solution rather than a desperate gamble. Within a week, he was teaching the maneuver to other pilots in his squadron during informal briefings. The instruction was simple. If a Zero gets on your tail in a position where you can't shake him conventionally, roll inverted, pull through, dive hard, use the speed to separate. Don't try to outturn him horizontally. The Zero owns the horizontal circle, but American fighters owned the vertical dive.
The physics behind why the inverted dive worked involved energy management and opponent prediction. When a Zero pilot achieved a tailing position, he anticipated the target would either try to outturn him, impossible, or attempt to climb away, which bled the American aircraft's energy and made it an easier target. The inverted dive did neither. It converted altitude into speed in a vector the Zero pilot didn't expect. More importantly, if the Japanese pilot attempted to follow through the maneuver, his aircraft faced structural limitations. The Zero was stressed for positive G loads up to about 7 Gs, but its lighter construction made negative G flight particularly dangerous. Pulling negative Gs in a Zero risks structural failure or engine problems because the aircraft's systems weren't designed for sustained inverted flight. The very characteristics that made the Zero deadly in turning combat, its lightweight construction, its optimization for positive G maneuvers, became vulnerabilities in vertical inverted combat. The P-38's twin Allison engines had another advantage. Unlike single-engine fighters with carbureted engines, which could experience fuel starvation during inverted maneuvers, the P-38's engines used different fuel systems that functioned more reliably under negative G loads. This wasn't a designed feature. Lockheed engineers weren't planning for inverted combat tactics, but it became operationally significant. A P-38 pilot could maintain power through an inverted dive, while some pursuing aircraft might experience momentary power loss, widening the separation. No training manual adequately prepared pilots for what negative G flight actually felt like. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. Blood pressure in the head increased dramatically. An intense feeling of pressure built behind the eyes, as if someone were inflating a balloon inside the skull. Then came the readout effect. The entire visual field turned crimson. Not darkness, that would almost be better, but a deep, blood-red curtain that obscured everything. Instruments disappeared. The horizon vanished. The enemy aircraft, the ocean, the sky itself, all gone, replaced by red. For 2 to 3 seconds, the pilot was effectively blind, flying at 400 miles per hour, pulling multiple Gs, with the Japanese fighter somewhere behind him in the ground somewhere below, completely unable to see. The readout came from blood vessels in the retina and conjunctiva, engorging with blood forced upward by the negative acceleration. Every capillary in the eyes and face swelled with excess pressure. The effect was temporary but absolute. During those seconds, the pilot relied entirely on kinesthetic sense and muscle memory to maintain aircraft control. Flight surgeon Captain James Moorhead, stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in late 1943, documented the physical aftermath. He examined dozens of pilots who regularly employed inverted dive tactics. Nearly all showed petechial hemorrhaging, tiny broken blood vessels creating red spots across their faces, particularly around the eyes and forehead. Some experienced subconjunctival hemorrhages that left their eyes blood red for days, as if they'd been in fistfights. Severe headaches were universal. The pressure changes caused vascular stress that lingered long after landing. A few pilots reported temporary vision problems, blurred sight, or difficulty focusing that lasted several hours. One pilot compared it to the worst hangover of his life, except it happened while stone sober and getting shot at. Moorhead's unofficial conclusion, never published in medical journals because the maneuvers remained technically unauthorized, was that the tactics caused measurable physical damage but nothing permanently debilitating. The greater risk was the moment of blindness itself. During those few seconds of readout, a pilot couldn't see his altimeter, couldn't monitor his airspeed indicator, couldn't check his attitude instruments. He certainly couldn't see the enemy aircraft or the ground rushing up to meet him. The maneuver required absolute commitment. A pilot had to establish the angle dive, pull the negative Gs, then hold that control input until his vision cleared, trusting that he judged his altitude correctly before rolling inverted. Several fatal accidents in training occurred when pilots initiated the maneuver too low or held the dive too long. There was no margin for error at 5,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, a pilot had time to correct. The mathematical calculation became part of survival doctrine. Never go inverted below 8,000 feet unless death was otherwise certain. Experienced pilots developed techniques to minimize the readout duration. Some learned to tense their neck and facial muscles, attempting to restrict blood flow to the head. Others discovered that if they rolled inverted but pulled less aggressively on the stick, trading maximum maneuver performance for slightly better vision, they could maintain partial sight throughout the maneuver. This became a judgment call that every pilot had to make in real time. Maximum negative G input generated the fastest separation from a pursuing zero, but caused complete visual blackout. Moderate negative G input allowed the pilot to keep some visual reference, but reduced the effectiveness of the escape. In practice, most chose maximum separation. Better to be blind for 3 seconds and alive than semi-aware and shot down. The psychological aspect was equally challenging. Human beings have strong evolutionary instincts against actions that cause pain and sensory deprivation. Voluntarily inducing temporary blindness while someone is trying to kill you runs counter to every survival instinct evolution has built into our nervous systems. Yet, pilots learned to override that instinct. The first time was terrifying, a leap into crimson darkness with no guarantee of survival. The second time was still frightening. By the 5th or 6th time, it became just another unpleasant aspect of combat flying, like flak, like fuel management, like watching friends die. The body adapted, the mind adapted. What seemed impossible in a training environment became routine when the alternative was a 20mm cannon shell through the cockpit. Several pilots noted in debriefings that they'd rather endure a splitting headache back at base than a proper burial at sea. The informal risk assessment was brutally simple. Negative G maneuvers hurt, but Japanese cannons hurt worse. The inverted dive tactic moved through the Pacific Theater like an underground transmission, spreading from squadron to squadron without ever appearing in official tactical publications. By September 1943, P-38 units across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were routinely teaching the maneuver to replacement pilots during their first week in country. The instruction happened informally. Veteran pilots would take new arrivals aside after evening mess, standing on the coral airstrips under Southern Cross stars, describing what worked and what got people killed. The conversations were matter-of-fact, stripped of drama. This is how you survive a zero on your tail. This is what the readout feels like. This is how low is too low. Learn it or die ignorant. Squadron commanders knew it was happening. Some actively encouraged it, recognizing that the tactic was saving lives regardless of what training manuals said. Others pretended not to notice, maintaining plausible deniability in case 5th Air Force Headquarters asked uncomfortable questions about unauthorized training. The hesitation to formalize the tactic wasn't just bureaucratic caution, there was genuine concern about liability. If a pilot was killed attempting the maneuver, questions would arise about who authorized teaching a tactic that contradicted established training. So it spread through word of mouth, veteran pilots sharing survival skills with new arrivals, person to person, squadron to squadron, invisible to official documentation. By June 1943, the tactic had spread to other P-38 units operating out of Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Pilots shared the technique during ready room discussions and inter-squadron debriefings. It remained officially unofficial, not prohibited, but not endorsed in formal tactical directives either.
The 475th Fighter Group, arriving in the Southwest Pacific in August 1943, received informal briefings on the inverted dive tactic from veterans of the 49th Fighter Group. Major Charles McDonald, who would eventually become one of the Pacific Theater's leading aces with 27 kills, later credited the Split S maneuver with saving his life on at least 3 occasions. His combat reports from late 1943 show a consistent pattern. Engage Zeros from altitude, make a high-speed pass, if counterattacked during the climb back up, roll inverted and dive away. Reset the engagement on favorable terms. It wasn't elegant dogfighting, it was industrial-strength survival mathematics that happened to produce victory. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts out of Port Moresby, incorporated the Split S into his unit's tactical doctrine in October 1943. The P-47 was even heavier than the P-38, making it hopelessly outmatched in turning combat against Zeros. But the Thunderbolt could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and its radial engine handled negative G flight reasonably well. Kirby's approach was pragmatic. He told his pilots explicitly that if they tried to turn with a Zero, they'd die. If they used the P-47's weight and power to dictate vertical engagements, diving attacks followed by inverted escapes when necessary, they'd survive and win. Kirby personally shot down 6 Japanese aircraft on October 11, 1943, using these tactics. He received the Medal of Honor for that mission. The citation mentioned his aggressive leadership and tactical skill, but made no specific reference to inverted flight maneuvers. The tactics remained invisible even in the highest recognition of valor. Marine Corps F-4U Corsair squadrons adopted similar techniques in early 1944. The Corsair had performance advantages over the Zero in most parameters except turning radius. Marine pilots operating from island bases like Munda and Vella La Vella found that the inverted dive worked even better in the Corsair than in twin-engine fighters. The F-4U's powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine maintained thrust through negative G maneuvers, and the aircraft's structural strength meant pilots could pull out of dives at higher speeds without worrying about wing failure. Major Robert Gaylor, teaching tactics to VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, demonstrated the maneuver repeatedly, emphasizing that it was a defensive escape tactic, not an offensive weapon. You didn't start fights with inverted dives. You ended them, survived them, reset them. The goal wasn't glory. The goal was getting home. By mid-1944, the technique had reached Navy carrier squadrons operating in the Central Pacific. Fighter pilots flying from carriers like USS Essex and USS Lexington received briefings that now included inverted maneuvers as accepted tactics. The official terminology varied. Some called it a split S, others referred to it as a negative G break, some simply described it as rolling out downward. The language didn't matter, the execution was consistent. When conventional defensive maneuvers failed, invert and dive. The safety threshold remained around 8,000 feet. Below that altitude, pilots were instructed to use other escape options or accept that they were in a fight to the death. Not all aircraft types could safely perform the maneuver. Navy F-46 Hellcat pilots reported that their carbureted engines sometimes coughed or quit during sustained inverted flight, though they usually restarted quickly. Army Air Force P-40 pilots found their aircraft structurally sound for the maneuver, but lacking the dive performance to create sufficient separation from pursuing Zeros. These limitations meant that tactics remained aircraft-specific. A P-38 pilot could rely on the inverted dive as a primary defensive tool. A P-40 pilot needed different escape options. But the underlying principle had become universal across the theater. Vertical maneuvers, including inverted flight when necessary, beat horizontal turning fights every time.
Japanese pilots eventually recognized the American inverted dive tactic and attempted to develop countermeasures. By late 1943, combat reports from returning Zero pilots mentioned American fighters rolling inverted and diving away at high speed. Initial Japanese assessments viewed this as purely defensive maneuvering, evidence that American pilots feared close combat and were fleeing rather than fighting.
This interpretation was strategically dangerous for Japanese airmen because it reinforced their existing tactical doctrine while missing the actual threat. The inverted dive wasn't retreat. It was a reset that allowed American pilots to choose when and how to re-engage on favorable terms. A pilot who dove away wasn't running. He was repositioning, building speed and energy, preparing to return with advantage. Japanese doctrine struggled to account for this because it violated their understanding of proper aerial combat. Some Japanese pilots tried following American fighters through inverted dives. The results were often fatal. The Zero's lightweight construction, which gave it superior turning performance, became a liability in high-speed vertical maneuvers. The aircraft's airframe was stressed to positive G limits, but had reduced safety margins in negative G flight. Several Zero pilots who attempted to follow P-38s through aggressive inverted dives experienced control surface flutter or structural failure. Wings buckled, ailerons jammed. At 400 miles per hour in a near-vertical dive, structural failure meant instant death. Others found that their Nakajima Sakai engines experienced fuel delivery problems during inverted flight, causing power loss at the worst possible moment, mid-dive, while trying to keep an enemy aircraft in sight. The engine would cough, sputter, or quit entirely. By the time it restarted, the American fighter had separated beyond pursuit range. A documented incident from December 1943 over Leh Gulf illustrated the tactic's lethality when Zero pilots attempted to counter it. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McGuire, flying a P-38, was engaged by 4 Zeros at 18,000 feet. When the lead Zero achieved a firing position, McGuire rolled inverted and dove. The Japanese pilot followed, attempting to keep McGuire in his gun sight. Two things happened simultaneously. McGuire's P-38 accelerated past 450 miles per hour in the dive while maintaining structural integrity. The pursuing Zero began experiencing severe vibration around 380 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot was forced to pull out early or risk airframe failure. McGuire leveled at 6,000 feet, climbed back into the fight with superior energy, and shot down 2 of the 4 Zeros. The other 2 disengaged. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that their most effective aircraft was optimized for the wrong kind of combat by late 1943. Early in the war, when engagements occurred at medium altitudes and involved prolonged turning fights, the Zero's characteristics were ideal. But as American tactics evolved toward high-speed slashing attacks and vertical maneuvers, the Zero's advantages became irrelevant, while its disadvantages, lack of armor, lightweight structure, lower dive speed, became critical vulnerabilities. Japanese aircraft designers recognized this problem. Later model Zero variants and newer designs like the J-2M Raiden had improved dive performance and stronger structures. But these aircraft arrived in limited numbers and too late to change the tactical balance. Japanese training programs couldn't adapt quickly enough. By 1944, Japan was losing experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. New pilots received abbreviated training that emphasized basic flight skills and traditional dogfighting tactics. There wasn't time or fuel to teach advanced energy management or vertical combat techniques. Meanwhile, American training programs had incorporated lessons from combat veterans. Replacement pilots arriving in the Pacific in late 1944 already knew about inverted dive tactics before they flew their first combat mission. The knowledge gap had reversed. Japanese pilots, once the most experienced in the theater, were now often the least prepared for the war's actual tactical environment. The inverted dive tactics developed over the Pacific between 1943 and 1945 didn't disappear when World War II ended. They became embedded in fighter tactics doctrine, although often without attribution to the desperate innovations of P-38 and Corsair pilots fighting for survival over New Guinea and the Solomons. Modern fighter combat training at institutions like the Navy Fighter Weapons School, known as Top Gun, includes negative G maneuvers as standard defensive tactics. The terminology has changed. Contemporary pilots call it a negative G pushover or unloaded roll, but the fundamental physics and purpose remain identical to what Thomas Lynch figured out over the Huon Gulf in April 1943. The Korean War saw American pilots employing similar tactics against MiG-15s. The Soviet-built jet fighter had excellent high-altitude performance and could outturn most American aircraft in horizontal combat. F-86 Sabre pilots, facing analogous problems to what P-38 pilots encountered against Zeros, used vertical maneuvers and negative G escapes when MiGs achieved advantageous positions.
Captain Joseph McConnell, the top American ace of the Korean War with 16 kills, credited his survival in several engagements to what he called rolling out underneath pursuing MiGs, precisely the same inverted dive concept now applied to jet combat at 40,000 feet and 600 miles per hour. Vietnam-era fighter pilots rediscovered these lessons the hard way. Early in that conflict, American pilots trained primarily for beyond-visual-range missile combat found themselves in close-range dogfights against nimble MiG-17s and MiG-21s. The initial engagement results were poor. The establishment of Top Gun in 1969 at Naval Air Station Miramar represented institutional acknowledgement that dogfighting skills, including negative G defensive maneuvers, remained critically important despite technological advances. Instructors at Top Gun taught tactics that Pacific War veterans would have recognized immediately. Use your aircraft's strengths, avoid the enemy's advantages, and when defensive, go vertical and inverted if necessary. Modern fighter aircraft are designed with negative G capability built in. The F-16, F/A-18, and F-35 all have fuel systems, engine designs, and structural strength that allows sustained negative G flight without the limitations that plagued World War II aircraft. Pilots train in centrifuges to build tolerance for both positive and negative G forces. The redout effect that terrified pilots in 1943 is now a known and manageable phenomenon. But the underlying principle hasn't changed. Negative G flight allows maneuvers that opponents don't anticipate, creating separation and opportunities for counterattack. It transforms a defensive position into an offensive reset. It turns geometry against the pursuer. What makes the Pacific War innovation remarkable is that it happened entirely outside official channels. No aeronautical engineer designed the tactic. No tactical development board approved it. No training command incorporated it into syllabi until after pilots had already proven its effectiveness through hundreds of combat engagements. It spread through the warrior network, experienced pilots teaching survival skills to new arrivals, person to person, squadron to squadron. The innovation moved faster than doctrine, faster than official recognition, faster than the bureaucracy could document or regulate. The men who developed these tactics didn't receive recognition beyond their immediate units. Most never knew their improvised solutions would influence fighter combat doctrine for the next 80 years. Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 victories, survived the war partly because he mastered vertical combat and wasn't afraid to fly inverted when circumstances demanded. His combat reports show a pattern of aggressive engagement followed by vertical escape when pressed. He understood that killing the enemy was important, but surviving to fight again was essential. Bong died in August 1945. Not in combat, but in a P-80 Shooting Star test flight, killed by an engine failure during takeoff. He survived hundreds of combat missions over the Pacific, flew inverted through redout countless times, faced down Japanese aces in their element, only to die in a peacetime accident. The irony wasn't lost on his fellow pilots. Thomas Lynch, who first employed the inverted dive tactic intentionally, was killed in action over the Philippines in March 1944. Not because his tactics failed, they'd saved his life dozens of times, but because combat flying was statistically lethal regardless of skill. Even the best pilots, using the best tactics, faced odds that eventually caught up with them. Lynch's death came during a low-altitude strafing run against Japanese positions. He was too low for an inverted dive, too committed to the attack to break off.
His P-38 took ground fire, caught fire, and crashed. He was 24 years old. The tactic he pioneered lived on, taught informally to new pilots who never knew his name. Charles McDonald survived the war with 27 kills, making him the fourth highest-scoring Air Force ace in the Pacific Theater. In post-war interviews, he spoke matter-of-factly about the inverted dive maneuver, describing it as just another tool in the tactical toolbox. He credited it with saving his life at least 3 times, but saw nothing particularly heroic about it. It was simply what worked. Neil Kirby, who incorporated the Split S into his unit's official doctrine, was killed in action in March 1944 over Wewak, New Guinea. His Medal of Honor citation praised his aggressive tactics and leadership, but made no mention of the inverted flight techniques he'd championed. Those tactics remained invisible in official recognition even as they saved lives across the theater. The anonymity of the innovation reflects something fundamental about how military tactics actually evolve. The men in the cockpits, facing death in real time, didn't care about recognition or historical credit. They cared about survival and victory, in that order. They shared what worked because their friends' lives depended on it, not because they expected medals or mentions in tactical manuals. The inverted dive worked because it exploited fundamental principles of energy management and opponent psychology that conventional tactics ignored. In aerial combat, energy equals life. Energy comes in 2 forms: kinetic, speed, and potential, altitude. A pilot with superior energy can dictate the terms of engagement. He can choose to attack or disengage based on advantage. A pilot with inferior energy is defensive, reactive, vulnerable.
The Zero's greatest advantage, its tight turning radius, came at a cost. Turning bleeds energy. The tighter the turn, the faster energy dissipates. The Zero in a hard turn was consuming its energy budget to maintain its position advantage. If that turn didn't result in a kill, the Zero pilot had to either disengage to regain energy or risk being caught in an energy-depleted state. The inverted dive converted potential energy, altitude, directly into kinetic energy, speed, without entering the turning fight where the Zero held advantage. By rolling inverted and diving, the American pilot was trading altitude for speed along a vector the Zero couldn't efficiently follow. Pursuing through an inverted dive required the Zero pilot to also roll inverted and dive, which meant accepting negative g-forces in an aircraft not designed for them. Even if the Zero structure held, the pilot faced the same red-out effect without the training or psychological preparation American pilots had developed. Most Japanese pilots, encountering this situation, made the rational choice: break off the pursuit rather than risk structural failure or spatial disorientation. The separation created by the dive, typically 6,000 to 8,000 feet of altitude differential and 100 to 150 miles per hour of speed advantage, allowed the American pilot to reset the engagement. He could choose to re-engage from a position of advantage, continue the dive to escape entirely, or use the speed to climb back to altitude before the Japanese formation could reorganize. The tactic transformed defensive positioning into offensive opportunity. A pilot being pursued, in what appeared to be a losing situation, could execute a maneuver that not only escaped the immediate threat, but positioned him for a counterattack. The psychology was powerful. Japanese pilots learned that achieving a tail position on an American fighter didn't guarantee a kill. It might be a trap. This psychological dimension changed the nature of engagements. Japanese pilots became more cautious, less willing to press attacks on apparently vulnerable American fighters. That hesitation, measured in seconds, often meant the difference between a successful attack and a missed opportunity. Official records don't capture the full cost of developing inverted flight tactics. The casualties attributed to training accidents or operational losses in 1943 included pilots who initiated inverted dives too low, misjudged their altitude during redout, or experienced aircraft malfunctions during negative G flight. Several documented incidents from the Russell Islands and Guadalcanal involved experienced pilots who died practicing the maneuver in non-combat situations. Lieutenant James Morrison, a P-38 pilot with 5 confirmed kills, rolled inverted during a training flight in September 1943 and never pulled out. His aircraft impacted the ocean at high speed. The official cause was listed as spatial disorientation, but squadron mates knew he'd been practicing split-S maneuvers. Captain Robert Westbrook crashed during a mock dogfight exercise in October 1943. Witnesses reported he rolled inverted at approximately 7,000 feet, right at the edge of the safety threshold, and either misjudged his altitude or experienced control problems during the recovery. He didn't survive. These losses don't appear in combat statistics. They're not counted as enemy kills, but they were part of the price paid for developing tactics that would eventually save hundreds of lives. The pilots who died in training accidents were as much casualties of innovation as those shot down in combat. The physical toll on pilots who regularly employed inverted tactics was undocumented in official records. Chronic headaches, vision problems, and the cumulative stress of repeated red-out experiences took their toll. Some pilots developed anxiety about the maneuver even as they continued to use it, knowing they might need it to survive their next engagement. Flight Surgeon Moorhead's observations included notes about pilots who showed signs of what would now be recognized as traumatic stress related to negative G flight. One pilot described feeling like someone was driving nails through my eyeballs every time I rolled inverted. Another reported nightmares where he was trapped in a perpetual red-out, unable to see, unable to pull out, falling endlessly. But both continued flying combat missions because the alternative, not using the tactic when needed, meant certain death. The informal nature of the training meant there was no standardized instruction, no safety protocols, no systematic approach to teaching pilots how to manage the physiological effects. Some squadron commanders were excellent teachers, walking new pilots through every aspect of the maneuver. Others simply said, roll inverted and dive, and expected pilots to figure out the details themselves. This inconsistency led to preventable accidents. Pilots who didn't understand the importance of the 8,000-foot minimum altitude initiated the maneuver too low. Pilots who didn't know about muscle tension techniques to reduce red-out severity experienced longer periods of blindness. Pilots who weren't warned about the after effects pushed themselves too hard, flying multiple combat missions in a day with cumulative physiological stress building to incapacitation. By late 1944, some squadron commanders began implementing informal standardization. They designated experienced pilots as unofficial instructors who would take new arrivals up and demonstrate the maneuver, explaining the sensations, the altitude requirements, the recovery techniques. This peer-to-peer training probably saved lives, but it remained outside official channels, undocumented and unrecognized.
The transition from unofficial tactic to recognized doctrine happened gradually, without any single defining moment. By early 1945, training materials being produced stateside began including references to high-speed vertical escapes and negative G recovery techniques. The language was carefully neutral, avoiding explicit endorsement while acknowledging the tactics existed. Advanced training bases in California started incorporating negative G awareness into their curricula, not teaching the inverted dive explicitly, but exposing pilots to the physiological effects in controlled environments. Instructors would demonstrate brief negative G maneuvers so replacement pilots heading to the Pacific wouldn't experience red-out for the first time while being shot at. The 5th Air Force Tactical School at Nodsab, New Guinea, began offering formal instruction in vertical combat tactics in March 1945. The course included segments on energy management, high-speed dive characteristics, and recovery procedures from unusual attitudes. Instructors were combat veterans who'd used inverted dives successfully. They taught from experience rather than manuals, but the instruction was now official, documented, part of the training pipeline. What drove this formalization was simple mathematics. By late 1944, units employing vertical tactics in inverted dive escapes were showing significantly better loss rates than units relying on conventional tactics. Squadron commanders couldn't ignore the data. Pilots using these techniques were surviving and winning. The 475th Fighter Group, which had embraced the tactics early, showed a kill-to-loss ratio of nearly 4-to-1 between September 1943 and December 1944. Comparable units still emphasizing horizontal maneuvering showed ratios closer to 2-to-1. The difference represented dozens of pilots who returned home instead of becoming casualties. Staff officers at 5th Air Force Headquarters faced a choice: continue officially ignoring tactics that were clearly effective, or acknowledge them and formalize training. By early 1945, the choice was obvious. The war was still being fought, and every pilot life mattered. Doctrinal purity couldn't compete with operational effectiveness. The formal recognition came without fanfare. No announcements were made, no credit was given to the pilots who developed the tactics. Training syllabi simply began including material on vertical combat and negative G maneuvers as if they'd always been there. The underground revolution became official policy so quietly that most people didn't notice the transition.
By the time Japanese Aviation Command recognized the full implications of American vertical tactics, they lacked the resources to respond effectively.
The newer aircraft designs that might have countered these tactics, faster, stronger, better suited for high-speed combat, were arriving in numbers too small to matter. The Kawasaki K61 Hien, Tony, had better dive performance than the Zero and could handle negative G loads more safely. But production numbers were limited and quality control problems plagued the aircraft throughout its service life. Many units that were supposed to receive Tonys continued flying Zeros because replacement aircraft simply weren't available. The Japanese Ki-84 Hayate Frank, which entered service in mid-1944, was arguably the best all-around Japanese fighter of the war. It could compete with American fighters in vertical maneuvers and had the structural strength to survive high-speed dives. But it arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. By the time significant numbers of Franks reached operational units, Japan was losing the war on all fronts. More critically, the pilot quality gap had become insurmountable. The experienced aviators who dominated the war's early years were dead, injured, or worn down by continuous combat. Their replacements received minimal training, sometimes as little as 40 hours of flight time before being sent to operational units. These pilots barely had the skills to fly their aircraft competently, much less master advanced combat tactics. American pilots arriving in theater in 1945 often had 200–300 hours of flight training, including advanced combat tactics, gunnery practice, and formation flying. They knew about inverted dive escapes before they ever saw a Japanese fighter. They'd practice energy management and vertical combat at training bases. The experience gap that had favored Japan in 1942 had completely reversed by 1945. Japanese tactical doctrine struggled to adapt to this reality. Training manuals continued emphasizing traditional dogfighting techniques because those were the tactics experienced instructors knew. The few attempts to teach newer pilots about American vertical tactics were hampered by lack of fuel for training flights and lack of time for proper instruction. Some Japanese pilots, through combat experience, learned to avoid pursuing American fighters into vertical dives. But this defensive adaptation meant conceding the initiative to American pilots who could attack, disengage at will, and reset engagements on favorable terms. It was a losing proposition, survival without victory. By mid-1945, American air superiority over the Pacific was absolute. Japanese aircraft losses exceeded replacement production. Experienced pilots were increasingly rare. The tactical innovations that had begun with desperate inverted dives in 1943 had contributed to a broader transformation of air combat that Japan couldn't match.
The Korean War provided an unexpected testing ground for whether World War II aerial combat innovations remained relevant in the jet age. When American F-86 Sabres began encountering Soviet-built MiG-15s over MiG Alley in late 1950, pilots quickly discovered that many lessons from the Pacific War still applied. The MiG-15 had advantages similar to the Zeros: superior turning radius at certain speeds, excellent high-altitude performance, and lethal armament. Soviet and Chinese pilots flying MiGs had learned their tactics from World War II veterans who'd fought on the Eastern Front. They understood energy combat and employed sophisticated tactics. American Sabre pilots found themselves in situations eerily reminiscent of what P-38 pilots had faced against Zeros. In a sustained turning fight, especially at higher altitudes, the MiG could often outturn the Sabre. If American pilots fought the way the enemy expected, they lost the advantage. Captain James Jabara, who became the first American jet ace by shooting down his 5th and 6th MiGs on May 20, 1951, later described his tactics in terms that could have come from Thomas Lynch's debriefings 8 years earlier. When a MiG gets on your tail and you can't shake him in a turn, you roll and dive. Use your speed advantage, separate, reset, come back with advantage. The specific maneuver Jabara and other successful Sabre pilots employed was essentially the World War II split S adapted to jet speeds. Roll inverted, pull negative Gs, dive to build speed, separate from the pursuer, use the speed to climb back into favorable position. The physics were identical, just executed at 600 miles per hour instead of 400 miles per hour, at 40,000 feet instead of 15,000 feet. The physiological effects were similar too. Jet pilots experienced redout during negative G maneuvers, though modern anti-G suits and better understanding of the phenomenon made it more manageable. Pilots trained specifically for negative G tolerance, something that had been almost unthinkable in 1943. Captain Joseph McConnell Jr., who became the top American ace of the Korean War with 16 kills, credited his survival in multiple engagements to vertical tactics and negative G escapes.
His combat reports consistently show a pattern: engage from advantage. If the situation turns unfavorable, go vertical and reset. Never stay in a turning fight where the enemy has advantage. The success of these tactics in Korea validated what Pacific War pilots had discovered through desperation. Vertical combat and negative G maneuvers weren't just survival techniques for piston engine fighters against Zeros. They were fundamental principles of aerial combat that transcended specific aircraft types or eras. By the early 1960s, the U.S. military had largely forgotten the lessons of dogfighting. Strategic doctrine emphasized nuclear deterrence and beyond visual range missile combat. Fighter pilots trained primarily for intercepting Soviet bombers, not for close-range maneuvering combat. When American pilots encountered North Vietnamese MiG-17s and MiG-21s over Hanoi in 1965-66, they were unprepared for what followed. The MiGs, flown by well-trained Vietnamese pilots advised by Soviet instructors, employed tactics designed to negate American technological advantages. They forced close-range engagements where their aircraft's turning ability and their pilots' dogfighting skills gave them advantage. Initial results were concerning. American kill-to-loss ratios were far lower than expected. In some periods, they approached 1-to-1, unacceptable for what was supposed to be a dominant air force. The problem wasn't aircraft performance. American F-4 Phantoms had significant advantages in speed, weapon systems, and radar. The problem was that American pilots didn't know how to dogfight effectively. The establishment of the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, at Naval Air Station Miramar in March 1969 represented institutional acknowledgement of this gap. The school's mission was explicit: teach fighter pilots how to win close-range aerial combat against agile opponents. The instructors at Top Gun, many of them Vietnam combat veterans, taught tactics that World War II pilots would have recognized immediately: energy management, vertical maneuvers, using speed and altitude advantages, and yes, negative G escapes when necessary. Commander Dan Peterson, one of Top Gun's founding instructors, later described the curriculum. We taught them to think in 3 dimensions, not just horizontal turns, but vertical maneuvers. How to use altitude and speed to dictate the engagement. How to escape when you're defensive, including negative G maneuvers if that's what survival requires. The school used dissimilar aircraft to simulate enemy capabilities. Smaller, more agile A-4 Skyhawks played the role of MiGs, forcing F-4 crews to develop tactics that worked against more maneuverable opponents. The training was intense, realistic, and humbling for pilots who'd thought they were already experts. One critical lesson emphasized at Top Gun was the split S and other negative G maneuvers as defensive escapes. When an instructor in an A-4 achieved a simulated kill position on a student's F-4, the debrief would explore alternatives. Could you have extended away using speed? Could you have gone vertical earlier? If you were truly defensive with no other options, why didn't you roll inverted and dive? Students who'd never heard of the tactic learned it was standard procedure. Those few who had heard of it, perhaps from fathers or uncles who'd flown in World War II or Korea, found validation that the old tactics remained relevant.
The impact of Top Gun on Navy combat effectiveness was measurable. Squadrons whose pilots had completed the program showed significantly better performance in combat. The kill-to-loss ratio improved dramatically. By 1972, Navy pilots were achieving ratios above 10-to-1, comparable to the best performance from World War II. The Air Force established similar programs, including red flag exercises at Nellis Air Force Base that emphasized realistic combat training. The lessons were consistent across services. Dogfighting skills matter, vertical maneuvers are essential, and negative G flight is a legitimate survival technique. Contemporary fighter aircraft are designed from the outset to handle negative G flight without the limitations that plagued World War II aircraft. The F-16 Fighting Falcon, introduced in the late 1970s, can sustain -3 Gs without structural risk or engine problems. Modern fuel injection systems eliminate the fuel starvation issues that affected carbureted engines. Strengthened airframes handle negative loads that would have torn apart a P-38 or Zero. Pilot training has evolved to match aircraft capabilities. Modern fighter pilots train in centrifuges that can subject them to both positive and negative G-forces,
building physiological tolerance and teaching techniques to manage the effects. They learn about red out in classroom settings before experiencing it in controlled flight environments. The anti-G suit, standard equipment for fighter pilots, helps manage blood flow during both positive and negative G maneuvers. While it can't completely prevent red out during sustained negative G loading, it reduces the severity and duration of visual impairment. Despite these technological advances, the fundamental tactics remain unchanged. When an F-22 Raptor pilot finds himself in a defensive position against a more maneuverable opponent, rare but possible in training scenarios against aircraft like the F-16, one standard escape option is to roll inverted and dive, trading altitude for energy separation. The execution happens at supersonic speeds, with advanced flight control systems assisting, but the principle is identical to what Richard Bong discovered over the Solomons in 1943. Current fighter tactics manuals explicitly include negative G maneuvers in the defensive tactics section. The language is technical, clinical, stripped of the desperation that characterized their original development. When conventional disengagement techniques are ineffective, a negative G roll and dive maneuver can provide rapid separation from a pursuing adversary. Initiate by rolling inverted, applying forward stick pressure to achieve negative 2 to 3 G loading, maintaining the maneuver until separation is achieved or altitude constraints require recovery. That paragraph, appearing in official U.S. Air Force training documents, represents the formalization of tactics developed in cockpits where the alternative was death, refined through decades of combat experience, and finally codified as standard procedure. What makes the story of inverted flight tactics remarkable isn't the technical innovation, it's the human element. These were young men, most in their early 20s, who faced lethal threats and responded by rewriting the rules of their profession in real time. They weren't test pilots in controlled environments. They weren't engineers with years of study. They were combat pilots who learned that survival sometimes required doing things they'd been explicitly told would kill them, and who had the courage to try anyway. The first pilot who rolled inverted with a 0 on his tail and survived had no guarantee the maneuver would work. He couldn't know if his aircraft would handle the negative G loads, if his engine would keep running, if his vision would return before he hit the ground. He did it anyway, because the alternative was certain. That initial success led to experimentation. Other pilots, hearing about the incident, tried similar maneuvers. Some survived, some didn't. The survivors shared what they learned. The process repeated across squadrons, across aircraft types, across the entire theater. Each iteration refined the technique, identified the limits, established the safety parameters. This was innovation in its purest form, rapid iteration under life-or-death pressure, with immediate feedback loops and unforgiving consequences for failure. There were no second chances, no do-overs, no opportunity to learn from mistakes unless someone else made them first. The pilots who developed these tactics displayed remarkable courage, but also remarkable analytical thinking. They didn't just execute desperate maneuvers randomly. They observed what worked, what didn't, and why. They analyzed their own physical reactions and learned to manage them. They tested limits incrementally, pushing boundaries without exceeding their aircraft capabilities. Thomas Lynch's contribution wasn't just surviving an inverted dive, it was recognizing that his survival was repeatable, that the maneuver could be taught and standardized, that it represented a tactical solution rather than a lucky accident. That cognitive leap from experience to analysis to doctrine separated random survival from systematic innovation. The informal teaching network that spread these tactics demonstrated another aspect of military innovation, often overlooked in official histories. The most effective tactical development doesn't come from command headquarters or training schools. It comes from practitioners sharing hard-won knowledge with peers, motivated by mutual survival rather than institutional requirements. By the time World War II ended in August 1945,
The inverted dive tactic and related vertical combat techniques had become standard procedure across the Pacific theater. The transformation from desperate innovation to accepted doctrine had taken less than 2 years, remarkably fast for military organizations typically resistant to change. The impact on combat effectiveness was measurable. American fighter units in late 1944 and 1945 achieved kill-to-loss ratios that would have seemed impossible in 1942. The 5th Air Force, operating primarily in the Southwest Pacific, reported ratios above 8-to-1 in some periods. Marine Corps and Navy units achieved similar results. These statistics represent lives saved. American pilots who survived encounters that would have killed them in 1942, who returned to base and flew again the next day, who eventually went home to families and civilian lives. The tactics developed through desperate innovation gave them that chance. But the statistics also obscure the cost. The pilots who died learning these techniques, who pushed the boundaries too far, who misjudged their altitude or their aircraft's limits. The ones who survived but carried permanent injuries, vision problems, chronic headaches, psychological trauma from repeatedly experiencing redout and temporary blindness. The families who received telegrams saying their sons or husbands were killed in training accidents, without knowing those accidents happened because young pilots were teaching themselves techniques that official doctrine said were impossible. The squadrons that lost experienced pilots to preventable accidents because the tactics remained unofficial and unstandardized for too long. There's no memorial to the pilots who died developing inverted flight tactics, no official recognition of their contribution to American air power. Most of their names appear only in casualty lists and accident reports, their deaths categorized as operational losses rather than combat casualties. Yet their contribution was as significant as any battle victory. They proved that human beings could adapt to physiological stresses considered impossible. They demonstrated that survival sometimes requires violating established rules. They showed that tactical innovation often comes from below, from the people actually doing the fighting, rather than from above. Official doctrine in 1942 said negative G flight was dangerous and should be avoided. That doctrine was based on valid engineering and medical data. The aircraft weren't designed for it. The human body couldn't tolerate it. The risk of catastrophic failure was unacceptable. All of that was true in peacetime, in controlled environments, when the cost of failure was mechanical damage and bruised egos. But in combat, when the alternative to negative G flight was 20mm cannon shells through the cockpit, the risk calculus changed entirely. The pilots who rolled inverted despite the warnings weren't reckless. They were recalculating survival probability in real time with perfect clarity. Negative G maneuvers might cause problems. Staying in the zero's gun sight definitely would cause problems. The choice was obvious. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Official doctrine lags behind tactical reality because doctrine is written by people not currently being shot at. The pilots, soldiers, or sailors facing immediate threats make adaptations based on what works, not what manuals say should work. Sometimes those adaptations are temporary, specific to particular circumstances. But sometimes they represent genuine discoveries, situations where official doctrine was wrong, where the boundaries were more flexible than believed, where the impossible turned out to be merely difficult. The inverted dive fell into that second category. It wasn't just a desperate trick that worked once. It was a fundamental tactical technique that remained valid across decades, across different aircraft types, across the transition from propeller to jet to modern fly-by-wire fighters. The pilots who discovered it didn't have the luxury of waiting for official approval. They needed solutions immediately, and they found them through experimentation, courage, and willingness to question authority when their lives depended on it. On a Coral airstrip in the South Pacific in 1943, a veteran P-38 pilot stands with a new replacement, fresh from training stateside. The sun is setting over the jungle, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would be beautiful if they weren't in a war zone. "Listen," the veteran says quietly. "They didn't teach you this in California, but you need to know it. When a Zero gets on your tail and you can't shake him any other way, and that will happen, trust me,
You roll inverted and dive. Your vision will go red. It'll feel like your head is exploding. You won't be able to see your instruments or the ground or anything. Do it anyway. Hold it for 3 seconds, then roll level. The zero won't follow, or if he does, you'll have separated by then.
The new pilot looked skeptical. They specifically told us never to do negative G maneuvers. Engine failure is structural. I know what they told you. I'm telling you what works. Your choice. Follow the manual and die, or do what I'm saying, and maybe go home someday. The next morning, the replacement flies his first combat mission. 3 days later, with a zero closing in on his tail, he remembers the conversation. He rolls inverted despite every instinct screaming against it, despite the training warning against it, despite the fear. His vision floods red. He can't see. He holds the dive. When his vision clears, he's alive. The zero is above him, out of position. He survives his first combat encounter, and many more after that, eventually teaching the same technique to other new arrivals, continuing the chain of informal knowledge that saved more lives than any official tactical directive. That's how real innovation happens in war. Not through bureaucratic processes or official channels, but through people under pressure finding solutions that work, then sharing those solutions because their friends' survival depends on it. The inverted dive tactics developed over the Pacific between 1943 and 1945 represent human adaptability at its finest. Young pilots discovered that the boundaries they'd been taught were absolute were actually negotiable, that the body could handle stresses considered impossible, that aircraft could perform maneuvers engineers said would cause failure, that survival sometimes required breaking every rule. Their legacy continues today every time a fighter pilot rolls inverted to escape a threat, every time a Top Gun instructor teaches defensive negative G maneuvers, every time an F-35 pilot uses vertical tactics to gain advantage. The techniques refined over Guadalcanal and New Guinea remain embedded in how fighter pilots think about combat, how they approach threats, how they survive. But the deeper legacy is the lesson that innovation under pressure often requires questioning authority, violating established doctrine, and trusting personal experience over official guidance. The pilots who survived the Pacific War didn't do so by following rules. They survived by learning when rules needed to break and having the courage to break them. In the depths of Kula Gulf, where USS Helena rests, and across countless other Pacific battlefield sites, lie men who never learned these lessons, who died fighting according to doctrine that didn't account for reality. Their deaths weren't meaningless. They provided the pressure that drove innovation, the urgency that forced adaptation. The pilots who flew inverted, who experienced redout and temporary blindness while enemy fighters pursued them, who survived through courage and innovation rather than luck, proved something essential about human nature. We are not limited by the rules we're taught. We are limited only by our willingness to question those rules when survival demands it. That's the real story of why fighter pilots started flying upside down. Not because it was in the manual, not because commanders ordered it, but because young men facing death discovered it worked, shared that discovery with their brothers in arms, and together rewrote the rules of aerial combat from the cockpit. Their innovation continues to save lives 80 decades later, and somewhere in the sky above us, a fighter pilot is rolling inverted, pulling negative Gs, experiencing the redout that terrified pilots in 1943, and using a tactic born from desperation to survive another day. The machine gun cruiser Helena and the pilots who flew upside down share this common thread. They were Americans who refused to accept defeat, who turned tragedy into triumph through determination and innovation. Both prove that sometimes the greatest victories come not from following the rules, but from knowing when to break them. In cockpits over the Pacific, young pilots discovered this truth one desperate maneuver at a time. And in doing so, they changed aerial combat forever.